So, in our last few lectures, we unpacked the foundational narrative of Genesis 1 through 3, seeing how humanity was designed for relationship and rule, and how the rejection of God's word destroyed both of those things. And then we zoomed in even more detailed on Genesis 3:15, on that judgment, but also the promise of a future seed that will defeat Satan. So today we're going to step forward and we're going to see how this plays out, this fall plays out in the future as we go through Genesis chapters 3 through 11. So we are going to have a little bit of overlap with the last video where we talked about Genesis chapter 3, just to frame it in the following chapters as well. So once judgment's handed down in the garden, humanity finds itself outside of Eden, and they're wrestling with that reality of the curse. They don't wander out empty-handed, though. They have that promise that we talked about last time, the hope of the coming seed that's going to crush the serpent and restore the way to life and maybe even back to the garden. So in this video, we're going to trace how humanity responds to that promise and how this conflict starts to unfold across generations, and why Genesis 3 through 11 acts as kind of this relentless drumbeat that keeps us asking one central question: who is the promised seed? When is he going to come? What is going on here? So let's start by looking at how humanity steps out of the garden. In Genesis 3:15, God declares that an offspring, the seed, will have a final decisive encounter to defeat the serpent, and then this establishes that cosmic conflict that will frame the rest of the Bible. Now let's pay attention really closely to how Adam responds to the judgment. Work has just become toil, and life is now shadowed by death. But in Genesis 3:20, Adam turns to his wife and names her Eve, which in Hebrew means life or life-giving. Think about the faith that's embedded in that moment. Death has just been pronounced as a penalty for sin, but Adam turns around and names his wife life, because God has promised that through her offspring, life would continue and deliverance would come ultimately. So this creates a posture of intense expectation. Humanity leaves Eden, but leaves with anticipation. I would say constantly watching and searching for that descendant, that seed who's going to restore their relationship with God. So the search begins immediately in Genesis chapter 4. Eve gives birth to her firstborn son, Cain. And we talked about this in the last video, but it's worth repeating again. You can easily put yourself in Adam and Eve's shoes here. They're desperately hoping that Cain is the promised offspring. It's obvious that he would be the first choice to be the one to crush the serpent and reopen the gates to Eden. It seems like he should be the one, but really quickly the narrative shatters those expectations. It says that sin crouches at Cain's door and he gives in jealousy and anger. And we notice that, again, that very first death that's recorded in human history is not a quiet natural death of old age. It's a murder. Not only that, it's a brother murdering a brother. So rather than functioning as the righteous seed, someone in Eve's line, that righteous line who conquers evil, Cain is really embodying the serpent's character. He proves to be on the wrong side of the equation. Abel's dead. Cain is cursed to wander, and humanity's first candidate for the deliverer ends in a definitive and really heartbreaking failure. As Genesis 4 and 5 unfold, the narrative sets up two distinct lines that we thought about, we looked at in the last video, but they become very distinct, especially in Genesis 4 at the end and in Genesis 5. And they run parallel through history. This is definitely a design pattern that we need to track here. On one side, we have in Genesis 4, the line of Cain. Their identity is that of the evil seed that we're talking about. The trajectory is escalating violence and thinking only of themselves, and culminates in a man named Lamech. He's the ultimate form of unrighteousness. It says he's boasting about killing a young man 77-fold. So he's way worse than Cain. But then in Genesis 5, we have the line of Seth. This is Seth is granted to Eve after Abel's death. And Seth's lineage represents that righteous line, those who call upon the name of the Lord and carry the hope of the promise. And on that side, as we mentioned last time, we see its encapsulation, its pinnacle in Enoch. It says the man who walks with God. And so we think he probably is the seed, but he's taken up directly into heaven. So he doesn't experience death. Now, when people read Genesis chapter 5, a lot of times, understandably, they skip right past it because it seems like a dry list of names and numbers. But in biblical narrative, genealogies are rarely just data. They often have a lot of weight to them if you're paying attention to where they are, what they're doing, why they're there. So as we read through Genesis 5, the text again, it hits you with this just inescapable repetition over and over again. Every single generation, it keeps repeating, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. So why does the author keep repeating that over and over and over again? Because even in the righteous line of Seth, death still reigns supreme. Generation after generation hopes that maybe that next son is going to be the deliverer, but each one, that son eventually returns to dust. The punishment per sin is real, it's active, it's unavoidable, and the deliverer has not yet come. When we move forward and we open up Genesis chapter 6, we reach a familiar passage. It starts Noah and the flood, but the crisis deepens. Genesis 6 records the intermarrying between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Now, scholars and lay people, there's a lot of debate over exactly what these mean, what these phrases mean, and the exact identity of the groups. But within the narrative framework of Genesis 3 to 5, we can see and we could trace what the reality is, what the text is trying to tell us, that the distinction between the righteous line and the rebellious line is breaking down. Whoever this is talking to, the sons of God and the daughters of men, it makes it very clear that they are intermarrying, they're mixing, and it's causing something bad to happen. The righteous seed, that line, is becoming diluted and compromised as humanity gives itself over to corruption, and wickedness multiplies over and over and over again until the earth is filled with violence. So by the time God looks down on creation, the fragile hope of that seed promise has been squeezed down to just a single remaining family on the entire planet. Just a handful of righteous people are remaining in that righteous line. So that single family belongs to Noah. And as the narrative pauses on Noah, it gives us really strong signals that it seems like he might finally be that promised deliverer, that promised seed. So let's look at some of the clues that are built into the text. His name, first of all, in Hebrew, the name Noah sounds like the word for rest or comfort. It's super similar to that word. And so when he is named, it seems like they're naming him as the one who will bring them rest or bring them comfort. When he's born, his father explicitly says, "This one shall bring us relief from our work and our painful toil," saying this is the one who's going to get us back into the garden. It's going to remove this curse. So it's not very subtle here. They're coming on pretty strong. Preservation. When God brings judgment on the corrupt world through the flood, Noah alone finds favor in the eyes of the Lord, and he's preserved inside the ark. It really seems like he's the one that's been promised. In anticipation, humanity looks to Noah as the righteous champion who will finally lift the curse from the ground. So every literary light is flashing green, basically. It really looks like Noah is the seed that was promised. So this is intensified even more when Noah steps out of the ark into a cleansed earth. God has cleansed the earth with the flood. And Genesis intentionally frames this moment kind of as a second chance at Eden. In Genesis chapter 9, God blesses Noah and his sons, and he issues a command: be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Well, hopefully that sounds familiar to you because it's the exact creation God gave to Adam and Eve. So Noah looks like the righteous deliverer. He's been given an exact command that God gave to Adam and Eve. So the flood has reset creation. The wicked swept away. The waters have receded, and humanity has a fresh start. It looks like they're going to rule and steward the earth under God's blessing, and it really feels like Eden has been restored. So how does Noah measure up when we evaluate it against the seed promise? So let's just run really quickly through the scorecard. Has humanity been preserved? Check. Absolutely. A righteous remnant has survived through the flood. Is perfect peace restored? Unfortunately, no. Creation is still fractured. In Genesis 9, right after God to be fruitful and multiply and go into the earth, it also notes in the text that fear and dread of humanity will now fall upon all the animals. Harmony is not restored. So even though it looks like Noah's the one, we get a hint that he's not. And is sin eradicated? Absolutely not. Almost immediately after leaving the ark, Noah plants a vineyard, he gets drunk, lies exposed in his tent, and sin erupts in his own family through his son. Now, we don't know exactly the details. It's a little hard to work out what's going on, but it's the purpose of the text is very clear, that Noah is not the one. So the conclusion is pretty much inescapable. The post-flood restart's incomplete. Noah is a righteous man. He's an instrument of preservation, but he's not the ultimate deliverer. He's not the ultimate seed. Sin survives the flood and is still in the human heart, and the wait must continue. So as generations pass after Noah, human rebellion reaches again a post-flood climax in Genesis 11 in the Tower of Babel. The text records humanity gathering in the plain of Shinar, saying, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens." In the ancient Near East, tower structures like this, often called ziggurats, were viewed as a gate of the gods, like an artificial mountain to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. And that idea is very strong in this text. But this is not just an ambitious, architectural project. This is a systemic idol of human achievement, where they want to try and manipulate God, the divine, and claim ultimate autonomy over themselves. They want to rule themselves. So let's look at the motivation behind Babel in Genesis 11:4. It exposes those twin idols that drive the human rebellion: significance and security. First of all, significance. They say, let us make a name for ourselves. Instead of finding their identity as image bearers, whose purpose is to glorify and magnify the name of the Creator, they seek to glorify and magnify themselves and get autonomy from God. And then second, security. They say, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Well, God explicitly commanded them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the whole earth. But they're building a fortress to protect themselves in disobedience out of fear and preservation. They don't want to do what God said. So they want security. They don't want to fill the earth. Significance and security apart from God. That's really the driving force behind fallen humanity. That's why Babel in Genesis 11 is not just an isolated ancient event. Throughout the rest of Scripture, Babel, or Babylon as we know it, as it moves forward into later in the Old Testament and even in the book of Revelation, becomes a foundational design pattern. It's referred to over and over again. In Hebrew, Babel and Babylon, they're exactly the same word. From the Egyptian Empire to the original Babylonian Empire, from Imperial Rome all the way to modern secular society, Babylon represents any human culture or system organized in opposition to God. Look at the graphic on this slide where a modern skyscraper rests directly out of the ancient ziggurat. In every generation, humanity perpetually tries to build its own tower, seeking significance, security, and rule apart from God. So, by the end of Genesis 11, the narrative has demonstrated a repeating tragic cycle that defines human history when it's left to self-rule. And this is really, I think, in many ways, the point of these chapters, Genesis 1 through 11. So first, God creates, blesses, and provides clear commands. He provides. But then humanity wants autonomy. They reject God's word and choose self-will, and that leads to ruin. Human autonomy results in breakdown, corruption, judgment, and collapse. So God responds to Babel by scattering their languages and dispersing them across the globe. By the end of Genesis 11, we see that this human project is pretty much failed. The world is broken apart, languages are scrambled, and humanity is hopelessly lost in its sin. And we've seen this happen over and over and over again in these chapters. And so now we have a transition. It brings us into the next chapter, Genesis 12. It brings us into an ultimate kind of pivot point in the book of Genesis. Because humanity continues to turn to wickedness, God doesn't abandon his promise, but he shifts his strategy and what he's doing. Up to this point in Genesis 1 through 11, the focus has been universal, dealing with either the whole universe or the whole earth, nations, and humanity as a whole. But starting in Genesis 12, the lens zooms in much more tightly on a single man and his family, Abraham. So the universal catastrophe of Genesis 1 through 11 ends in the darkness of Babel, but out of that darkness, God calls Abraham, renewing his promise and declaring that through his offspring, all families of the earth will ultimately be blessed. So, in the next video, we're going to step into the narratives of the patriarchs, and we start to trace the promises through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, I hope you have enjoyed this and you're seeing some of these design patterns in these early chapters of Genesis because they're important and we're going to continue to see them as we move forward.